Welcome to St. John. Nothing Happened Here, with your hosts Greg Marquis and Mark Allen Green, a show all about a little city on the east coast of Canada where nothing ever happened. Except for this.
The hour itself, and nothing else.
Mark Green.
Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold to me?
I am.
Who and what are you?
I am the ghost of Christmas past.
My past?
No, St. John's past. Victorian era, to be precise.
What business brings you here?
Your interest in St. John's history and your quest for good stories. Rise and walk with me out the window.
Can't we just take the doors right over? Whoa! Guess not.
We have arrived.
Good heavens! This is where I grew up. I was a boy here. This is King Street Hill. But only a few of the buildings look familiar.
Because this is 1887.
Spirit, what is that glow coming from the window of this house?
Why, that is children playing Snapdragon.
Looks dangerous.
First-degree burns may have resulted.
And, Spirit, what is that larger glow coming from the big home on the corner?
They are lighting their Christmas tree with real candles.
Looks dangerous.
No insurance company would extend coverage for that.
But what is going on down the hill? There must be thousands of people gathered around that store.
That, Mark, is Manchester Robinson and Allison's. It is the largest department store in the whole of the Maritimes. And for the first time ever at a St. John's store, Santa Claus is coming to town.
Spirited. Seems like things are getting out of hand. A lot of pushing, shoving, fainting.
Yes, everyone is excited.
Looks dangerous.
I'm sure things will settle down.
Is that the police coming in?
Come, Mark, we better move on.
Oh, must we go? Can we not stay a little while longer?
We cannot.
But why not?
My time grows short. We have only 5 to 6 minutes for the opening story.
But Spirit, how will I find out more about Victorian Christmases in St. John?
By doing this. Keep listening to the podcast. Keep listening to the podcast. Keep listening to the podcast.
I will, Spirit, I will. Welcome to the podcast, everyone. My name is Mark, and over there sipping some eggnog is Greg, and that means St. John. Nothing happened here, with the exception of Victorian Christmases. I'm going to start by taking you back, Greg. I want you to remember yourself as an 8-year-old boy growing up in St. John, and tell me, what was your most favorite holiday tradition?
Well, within our family, our parents kind of lost that battle of keeping us in a room until 9 o'clock the next morning on Christmas Day. We wanted to see what Santa had brought us. So the compromise developed that if we woke up in the middle of the night after Santa had arrived, we'd be allowed to take one gift back to our bedrooms with us. That's how excited we were, right? And it's hard, as adults, it's really hard to get back into that mindset about how excited we were as kids at Christmas time.
Yes.
How about yourself?
Oh, hey, I wasn't expecting that question for you to be so personal. No, I was totally expecting that question. This would have been my favorite holiday tradition, was the Christmas tree. So I loved as a child coming home, opening up the front door and smelling that smell of pine that filled the entire house. Now, as an adult, I tried to recreate that moment. And I'm in Alberta right now. So I brought home a Christmas tree and expected it to fill my entire home with the smell of pine. And it did not. Now, I have 3 theories on why it didn't. One being that Alberta trees are not as fragrant as St. John trees. Number 2 is I'm getting old and my nose doesn't work as well as it used to. And number 3 is nostalgia, is I'm remembering it different. And that's an important thing when we're getting into Victorian Christmas because it's all about the nostalgia. But let's go way back in time. Let's go back to the origins of this celebration around this time of year. And we're going pagan, aren't we, Greg?
Well, going back even pre-Christian times, certainly the end of a season and the start of another season. It was a traditional time for feasting, right?
Mm-hmm. And winter solstice.
Yeah, and I think then in Christian societies in Western Europe, they inherited a lot of that, right? And that went on for a few centuries as Christianity blended some of these earlier practices and traditions.
Yeah, I'm glad you said blended, because a lot of the things we see today are blending of pagan traditions. And I believe that was a way to make Christianity more attractive when people were converting over to Christianity. So that was an important part. And then we have the Christmas celebration, but it wasn't what it ended up being in Victorian ages. And actually, it was outlawed in England for a particular period of time. I believe it was under the Oliver Cromwell rule.
Okay.
How the Puritans stole Christmas. They outlawed Christmas. I'll ask you this, Greg.
Yeah.
Was it banging the tongue tinglers or the foo flanders that really bothered them?
You're bringing in some Grinch here. Yeah, I don't know. I've heard that. I haven't really read into it, but during the Republic period, right?
The Puritans hated Christmas. They hated the celebration.
But then there's a restoration after, and things get sort of back. Christmas became was still an important celebration, and it went on for several days, right? I mean, in the English tradition.
Yes, the Georgian Christmas was the 12 days of Christmas.
Okay.
It would begin day number 1, Christmas Day, and it would take us all the way to Epiphany.
Oh, okay. And so gift giving, that probably wasn't a big deal at first. And so Christmas Day was like the launch date.
The launch date. And guess what the big gift giving day was?
New Year's Day or after?
New Year's Day.
Okay. Wow.
So originally it was New Year's Day, but then let's go to, this is kind of pre-Victorian, but this is what I would say kind of kicks it off a bit. A poem written in 1823, officially called A Visit from St. Nicholas, and better known as?
Well, we know him as Santa Claus.
No, but the poem is better known as?
Oh, 'Twas the Night Before Christmas.
Yes, written by Clement Clarke Moore. Now, there's a connection with Clement Clarke Moore and New Brunswick. I believe there's a copy of the original poem in the New Brunswick Museum. Am I correct with that?
Yeah, it's either the New Brunswick Museum or the archives. I seem to remember some connection. So it just showed, I think there might have been a personal connection with a family member, but, this was an American who wrote this poem, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So it was American, and he brought it to life. Santa Claus with the reindeer and coming down the chimney and visiting all of the anticipating children of the world. And it was originally published in a New York newspaper. And it just went from newspaper to newspaper. It was often published every year. It didn't really hit its popularity until 1840, when it was published in an anthology of American poetry. So that was kicking us into the Victorian era.
Yeah.
Now, Factory Act 1833, I would say, was another launch of the Christmas we know today. And that was an act to protect children from the 16 to 18-hour days that they had to work. And they were like, no, we got to bring in some law. Let's cut your 16-hour day down to a nice 9 or 10-hour day. The other thing it did was bring in statutory holidays for children under 18, one being Christmas Day. So 18-year-olds and under would get the day off. If you were over 18, you would not get the day off. But I think it was customary to give Christmas Day off. And I'm drawing that from A Christmas Carol, where even Ebenezer Scrooge was saying, well, to Cratchit, are you expecting to have the whole day off tomorrow, I suppose? A fine reason to pick a man's pocket every 25th of December. Yeah. So if Ebenezer Scrooge is giving the day off, I think that was a customary thing.
Yeah. And so, just to clarify, that Factory Act was in England. Right? Yeah. So we're talking about we're already developing this transatlantic story of Christmas.
We are.
Yep.
And give me a day off. What do I want to do, Greg?
Well, I guess the middle class people would probably want to spend time with their family.
I want to celebrate.
Yeah. But I mean, it could be just celebrated in different ways by different people. But yeah, it's a time to celebrate, a time to feast, a time to live it up a bit.
Yes. But before that, it wasn't a holiday at all. It was just a normal working day. So that's starting to change the nature of Christmas. And I did talk about A Christmas Carol.
Yep.
How did Dickens really invent Christmas?
Well, he sort of, he made it, I mean, getting back to the poem from 1823, it's kind of creating Christmas as a child-centered thing in a way, although the story is about family, and how Christmas saves a kind of grinchy, selfish sort of man. But it kind of puts the heart into Christmas, celebrating with family and friends, and Christmas cheer and helping people, right? And it's amazing how there's not a lot of direct religion in the Christmas Carol.
No, there's some debate if it's an allegory of Christianity, but there's nothing blatant in it.
No, he doesn't wake up on Christmas morning and say, "Hey, I'm going to church."
No, he does not. He does not. I think he says, "Go get a turkey from the to the boy from the local butcher." But yeah, so Dickens really started changing things. Now, this was a fun fact that I found is it's a ghost story. And I was like, well, ghost story Christmas? Why Dickens are you doing that? Why the Dickens are you doing a ghost story? And it's because that was actually a thing, telling of ghost stories on Christmas.
Okay. Yeah. So why the appeal of ghost stories at that time of year?
Victorians loved spiritualism.
Yeah.
They really did. And there was two things I read, and I don't know which one is true, or maybe neither of them are true, but there was the telling of Christmas ghost stories because the holiness of Christmas Day is you could tell Christmas stories or ghost stories to your kids, scare the dickens out of them. I'm sorry, I did it again, but scare the dickens out of them and go, oh, don't worry, the power of Christmas will keep the actual ghost away. Mm-hmm. But then there was another thing I read that the power of Christmas brought the ghost out and you could visit with people from your past. But other things that it really kicked off in that story is the reintroduction. And I should say Victorian Christmas is a lot of reintroductions of past things. It's not invention, but of the charitable side of Christmas, giving to the poor.
Right. Yeah. And helping, it's interesting that it's an individual helping other people. It's not the government helping the poor. It's the individual helping through private charity and of course, Tiny Tim and all that, right? So yeah. Yes. And also it's interesting because it's both giving to the poor, but it's also kind of a little bit of self-indulgence, right?
Well, let's bring on the frivolity of Christmas. And we saw that with the Ghost of Christmas Past and going to Fezziwig and seeing the dancing happening and the drinking and the food. Mm-hmm. Food became a big part of it. And that Christmas dinner really seemed to come from Dickens.
Yes.
Everyone's sitting around and having the Christmas turkey or goose or duck. Or if you were Queen Victoria, what would you have served for Christmas dinner?
Fresh swan.
The royal swan.
Yeah.
Have you ever had swan, Greg?
No, I think if I had swan, I'd be arrested, Mark, wouldn't I?
In most places, yes. I think there are some notable exceptions, but yeah, most places. So I have no idea how a swan compares to a turkey, but Queen Victoria loved her swan. Mm. So that brought in all those things. And one thing, games. So let's eat a lot and then let's go and play some Victorian games. These games were, I wouldn't say for the faint of heart.
Right. So you're talking parlor games, but maybe a little intense?
A little bit on the intense side.
Yeah.
So we had some games like Snapdragon, and we're going to talk about that a bit more when we get into St. John, but it involved fire. Let me just give you a teaser of what we're going to be doing. There was another game that was closely related to Snapdragon that I found, kind of known as the country cousin of Snapdragon, and it was called Flapdragon. Do you know how you play Flapdragon?
Fire, and I'm guessing if it's the Victorian era, maybe alcohol?
Yes and yes. So you would take a tankard of beer and you would put a lit candle in the center of it. And the goal was to drink the beer without getting too burnt.
Too burnt.
So, yeah, like you would get burnt. A lot of fine Victorian mustaches were lost during the playing of Flapdragon.
Yeah.
But those were some of the games. And then this other game that we played as a kid, but the Victorians took it to a whole new level. And that was Blind Man's Buff.
Okay.
Did you ever play that?
Blind Man's Bluff, that's where you put a blindfold on people and you try to get them to play tag or something? Or?
Yeah, you play tag.
Yeah.
But here's how the Victorians did it. So they would get drunk to begin with. So it involved a lot of alcohol. So you can imagine that. You would blindfold one of the guests, and then you would be chasing after people around a Victorian home with lots of big wooden sharp furniture. But here's the added thing to it is you were encouraged to try to put obstructions in the way of the person who's blindfolded. So grab an ottoman, put it in their way, have them trip over. So supposedly it was a bone setter's dream.
Yikes.
And then the other thing that came from A Christmas Carol, caroling.
Okay.
So not new, was it?
Well, church choirs, there would have been a lot of church choirs, but there's public singing, either in the home or maybe you go to other people's houses or maybe you just go out on the street.
Yes, going door to door, but that wasn't anything new. It was quite a thing in Germany before with the wassailing. You would go and sing songs and be invited in for a little bit of wassail, which was punch, and I'm sure there was some alcohol in it. But that really kickstarted it again as something to do at Christmas time in England. Yeah.
And it has echoes of mumming too, doesn't it? Like going door to door and asking for a treat and, So in terms of what were some of the songs? I mean, do you have any lists or anything? Or?
I have a list. Yeah. Do you want to play a game, Greg?
Sure.
Okay. I'm going to give you a name of the song, a carol, and you tell me if it was pre-Victorian, Victorian, or post-Victorian. Are you ready to play?
Okay.
Start off with Deck the Halls.
Ooh, Victorian?
Victorian.
Okay.
1862. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. One that couldn't sound more Victorian if we tried. God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen.
Ooh, I think that might be a bit older.
It is 1650.
Okay. Wow.
12 Days of Christmas.
Either older or early Victorian?
It is older, 1780. So it's in the Georgian period.
And then that's your 12 days, classic. Yeah.
Okay. This has to be post-Victorian. Jingle Bells.
In one level, it sounds post-Victorian, but I think I read that it was from the mid-19th century, and it's it's not a really religious song either. I mean, a lot of them do have some religion in them, right? Jingle Bells is just more celebrating the winter.
It's 1850. It's Victorian.
Winter sports.
And this has got to be Victorian. This has to be. We wish you a Merry Christmas. Bring us some figgy pudding. Come on. Can you get more Victorian?
It's misleading because I think it's early 20th century, but it's nostalgic for the earlier times, right?
Ding, 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 ding. Yes, you are right, Greg. So, those are some of the carols. And the ones we have from the Victorian era, I have 3, Jingle Bells, We Three Kings, Deck the Halls. 2 of them are American. Only Deck the Halls is from England. Yeah. So the Americans really got into caroling.
Yes.
And writing carols.
They did.
Now, we got to share the Christmas spirit and reach out to people. And what you would do at Christmas time before the Victorian era, I'd write a long letter telling all my friends, personalized, how great of a year I had and how my family is doing. Until one guy came along and goes, oh, that's too much writing. Yeah. There's got to be a better way. There's got to be a better way. And he had this friend, and his friend's name was John Calcott Horsley. And he was an illustrator. And this guy, his name was Henry Cole. He was an industrialist. And he says to his good friend, John, you got to make me a card. Okay, put a nice picture on front of it, say Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, whatever you want to do, so I don't have to write all of these notes. And he did, and he printed off 1,000 copies, and those were the first Christmas cards ever. Did they go over well?
I don't know. 1,000 doesn't sound like a lot.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like a lot, but it's not the number. It was what John drew on the front of the first Christmas card. It was a small child drinking
alcohol,
okay, along with her family. I think it was a small girl, and it did not go over well with the temperance movement. But it eventually would kick on when we got the second industrial revolution and the invent of the printing press, which made printing up 1,000 Christmas cards more financially viable.
And you're talking with Cole, he's British, but of course it takes on big time in the United States where there's a huge market, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And so that's 1843. Now take us to Queen Victoria. It's called a Victorian Christmas. So finally, we're talking about Queen Victoria. How did she kickstart Christmas into what we have today?
It was a kickstart, but it might have been a bit of a slow burning kickstart in some levels, but it was the family.
Unintended?
Yeah, okay.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, but I think first of all, it's the family, like Queen Victoria and her consort Prince Albert and their children, and home. It's a family unit with the Christmas tree and the decorations and the domestic space, right? That's very important, and the association with family and Christmas. So we see by the 1840s and 50s, Christmas is more and more associated with children and families, right? And so the Christmas tree was not part of England's cultural heritage, right? It came from where?
It came from Germany.
Yeah.
And it came from the pagan days of tree worship. So originally, I believe it was an oak tree that was decorated somewhat.
Yeah.
And then the Christians came in and go, guys, can you change your oak tree to a pine tree? Because the pine tree is a nice triangle shape, and triangles have 3 sides or 3 corners, and 3 corners really work with what? What?
The Holy Trinity, the Christian symbolism.
There we go. Yep. So it brings it all together.
Yeah.
But then, so Queen Victoria, influenced by Prince Albert, her German husband, brings a Christmas tree into Buckingham Palace.
And then it starts to spread because royals are fashion trendsetters, influencers, and it spreads. So I think by the 1850s, it starts to percolate through the rest of like middle-class society.
Because of magazines.
Yes, magazines, yes.
So 1848, Illustrated London News showed the royal family beautifully sitting around their Christmas tree with all their children, anticipating the gifts that were under it. And everyone goes, I want to be that.
Yeah.
Get me one of those things. Get me that holiday, that perfect holiday moment.
Yeah.
And that's what started bringing it in, because everyone really followed the royals. They wanted to be like their regent.
Because we're also influenced in Canada by the United States, so we're getting it from both sides of the Atlantic, right? And we're also there's already a tradition of using a lot of greenery, right? Even before the trees became a big thing. People were used to using greenery, I think, in their homes, right? On a seasonal basis.
But that got kickstarted again more with the magazine.
Yeah.
And there were women's magazines that started getting produced en masse. And it was like how to make the perfect Christmas.
Right.
So before, they would have some greenery to make the dreary winter seem a little bit more joyful. But they would take like, a little mistletoe, maybe some ivy, some holly, and just throw it around. Mm-hmm. And then that got replaced with the whimsical presentation of the greenery. And by whimsical, it sounds like you just throw it around, but no, it's carefully placed so it looks like you threw it around, but you didn't. So it gets into that. You got to do it perfectly. Now, back to the Christmas tree. How was it lit? Electric lights?
No, much later.
No, this is before electricity.
Candles, not good, Mark. Candles.
How many candles?
Lots of candles. Well, I mean, there are some guides I've read about. If you had a 12-foot tree, they recommended 400 candles on a 12-foot tree.
400 burning candles on a tree you cut down that's getting drier and drier as the days go on. So what I hear is it wasn't that I was going to light my Christmas tree up for the entire evening. How long would I likely light my Christmas tree up?
Maybe just, I don't know, a few minutes at a time while you're there. Maybe enough to show it off to your neighbors.
Maybe. And having a bucket of water ready to go.
Yes. Towels, buckets of water, and someone on fire watch.
There we go. And what did the insurance companies think of Christmas trees? Did they get into the Christmas spirit, Greg?
I've read eventually they stopped paying for damages caused by fires caused by Christmas trees.
I can see why. I can see why.
Yeah.
A fire waiting to happen. As you said, with Queen Victoria, she was big into the family. So this brought in the whole concept of home for the holidays. That was a very Victorian thing. Everyone come home for this one time of year.
Yeah, and it really creates a lot of pressure. And think about like if you're a sailor at sea or someone in the military and you can't get home, it becomes very sentimentalized, right?
Okay, so this is all coming together. We have our caroling, we have our day off, we have our Christmas decorations, and then bring in, at the same time, the second industrial revolution that started making mass production economically feasible. You could get things for low prices. And what does that sound like when I say lots of stuff for low prices?
It sounds like now.
It sounds like now we start getting into the commercialization.
Yeah.
Before the second industrial revolution, there were gifts, but they were smaller. They were often like you could have bags of nuts, maybe some candy, maybe a small little homemade toy. Maybe Johnny wanted a sled and Johnny's dad would make him a sled, and Susie wanted a doll. So Susie's mom would make her a doll.
Yeah.
But then as time went on, Johnny still wanted a sled, but he wanted a store-bought sled, and Sally wanted that store-bought doll.
One they saw in the window of the store, or if they lived in the country, maybe in a catalog, in the late 1800s, and brands, right? Certain type of brand. And so, Mark, do you ever think about wrapping? One of my least favorite Christmas activities. Like, where did that come from?
I thought it was just me, Greg. I hate wrapping. That is, I despise it with a passion. I'm not good at it. I can't fold those corners.
No, I think that's my thing too. So, but that wasn't a thing originally, right?
No, it wasn't. So you would walk in on not Christmas morning; it would be Christmas Eve. The gifts would be under the tree, but they would be unwrapped. So the children would just come in and go, it's go time. Yeah. Now, I believe they put their names on the toys so there weren't Christmas riots happening on Christmas Eve. But that's the way it was done.
And maybe small gifts on the tree. And again, getting back to your point about commercialization, I think the notion of what a gift was and how much you should spend, there's that social pressure there, which might have been a bit of a burden on some poor families. But, I think, if you go to the early 1800s, the notion of what a gift is probably pretty limited. By the late 1800s, late Victorian period, it's wider.
Yes, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because this is what Victorian Christmas brought us, is the one day of the year that you could step up a class. You could experience the finer things of a class that you are not part of. So it was the time of year that you were to loosen the purses, strings, and spend. So this worked well with commercialization because the big manufacturers realized that people were really getting behind this, that this was the time to not be pinching every penny, but to be spending it. Now, even with the poorer people, they had ways to try to make that season bright. And with the food, there were goose clubs in England. Yeah. And that is where you would take a couple of pennies every week and you would put it into this fund. And at Christmas time, you would get your Christmas goose. Now, it was given to you already cooked because poorer people in England did not have the cooking facilities to be roasting an entire goose.
Right. Yeah. So there's a lot of that we don't know about how people got by in, say, mid-Victorian St. John, but we have to assume they had a lot of challenges and they would have to maybe scrimp and save in advance for poor people and make sacrifices to make sure their family had some of those nice little items of food and presents at Christmas time.
Absolutely. Now, Greg, I'm going to give you my top 5 most dangerous Victorian traditions or things. As we said, Victorian Christmas involves a lot of fire.
Okay.
Are you ready for my top 5 list?
Ready.
Okay. Number 5 is glitter.
Hmm.
And you might go, how could glitter be dangerous? Well, it's how they made glitter.
Right.
So I read in one of the better housekeeping magazines of the time, they gave a recommendation on how to make glitter. And they said, take some glass around the house and take a rolling pin and smash it up into tiny little pieces. Take some glue and put it on your mistletoe, put it on your ivy, your holly, your Christmas tree. Now, we know glitter nowadays, right? It gets everywhere. Can you imagine that glitter getting everywhere and being little shards of glass?
Sounds dangerous.
That's why it's number 5.
Yeah.
But number 4 is Snapdragon.
Right.
And we'll get into more of how that is played. But again, it involves fire and children reaching into fire. Number 3 has to be Blind Man's Buff.
Yep.
Victorian style.
It sounds very dangerous. Yep.
It is extremely dangerous. So especially when you put in that you're trying to trip people up and they might be intoxicated at the time. Number 2 is holly berries.
Holly berries, not good for you?
Poisonous.
Uh-oh.
But delicious looking poison. So lots of Christmas poisonings happening with the eating of holly berries.
Little children would be attracted to berries because kids love berries. It would have been
or the intoxicated people too.
Yeah.
Don't forget about them. They kind of act like children.
But it would have been, seen as a real treat if they did know better.
If they didn't know better. So, and then number 1 by far has to be the candlelit Christmas tree coupled with flammable Christmas dresses.
Well, not only that, flammable Victorian homes.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, they were fire traps, right?
Oh, they were fire traps.
Yeah. So, again, it's hard to believe, what our ancestors did for fashion or for social practice or customs. But, so electric lights came much, much later. But until that time, you're stuck with candles, right?
And thank goodness they came.
Yeah.
Kind of, but they were a fire hazard originally too, because they got super hot. Do you remember the ones from back in the 60s and 70s? You couldn't touch them.
Yeah. They're pretty dangerous.
Thank goodness for LEDs.
Yeah.
Okay, Greg, we've talked about Victorian Christmases now, so we have a good understanding of what they are. Let's bring it to St. John. And guess what, Greg? I have a Christmas surprise for you.
What is it?
We have with us on the podcast episode, David Goss, who I would say is Mr. St. John Christmas.
Wow.
And guess what, Greg? He's right beside you.
Oh, he is? Oh, that's right.
Hey. So welcome, David Goss, to St. John Nothing Happened Here. David, you've written now, is it 12 or 13 books?
How about 25?
25 books. Wow. And a lot of them about St. John, a lot about the Maritimes. And I believe you've written 2 books specifically on Christmas.
That's right.
Okay, so you are the guy to talk about Christmas. You are Mr. Christmas. Can I call you Father Christmas?
No, that would be wrong.
That would be wrong. Okay, fair enough. Okay, so what I want you to do, David, if you can you take us for a little trip around Victorian Christmas time in St. John, New Brunswick?
Well, I would have to say 1848 was the change from practically no Christmas celebrations to the people getting interested. And it was all because of what you talked about in England and Queen Victoria and Prince Albert's picture appearing in a sketch of them around a Christmas tree. And that issue of the Illustrated London News would have come into St. John probably 8 weeks after it was published in Britain by ship. And it would have ended up in Cody's Coffee House or McPherson's Coffee House right on Market Square, where it would have been shared, and it would have given the idea for people then, we want to do what the royal family is doing. We want to have a Christmas tree. We want to have a Christmas celebration. And many people wouldn't have thought of it until that time.
Yeah, and St. John really liked to keep up with the Brits, it seemed.
They did. Yeah. Absolutely.
They wanted to be fashionable.
And about that time, too, the merchants caught on to the idea. In 1850, for instance, the only people selling toys to the children, for the children, were barbers. And barbers did it as a sideline.
Wow.
But then the merchants started to see, hey, this got to be it's a way to make some money too. And they started carrying toys. The earliest one I can figure it was Jardine's, whose store is still on Prince William Street, but it's not. The building is there with their name on it, but it's no longer Jardine's department store. But they were probably the first. And then along comes MRAs, who became the dominant merchants in St. John for a long, long time through the Victorian era and up until 1973. So that was a big change, I think, when that issue appeared and Christmas began to be commercially viable.
Okay, can we talk about decorations? Because you talked about the Christmas tree. Did the Christmas tree originally catch on, bring a tree into the home in St. John?
Actually, Christmas trees didn't catch on very quickly. It was almost 1900 before most people had a tree. Through the 1850 to 1900, maybe 10% would have a tree. But by 1900, almost everybody had a Christmas tree. But it was a slow catching on, even though trees were easy to get, relatively easy. Most people in that era would maybe go to Sandy Point Road or out what's now the Irving Nature Park area, cut their own tree and drag it home. But then by 1900, it became commercially viable for merchants or for sellers to send up a sales place in the King Square and sell trees commercially. But it was slow catching on.
Yeah, it seemed that way. And let's take a walk up King Street Hill. So that would have been where a lot of the big stores would have been, including MRAs. What did it look like? Did they deck the halls on the outside of the building, or did they keep the decorations inside? Would we have seen some beautiful greenery as we walked up the hill?
I would say that most of the merchants had window displays that had some kind of a Christmas theme. But interior decorations were not the big thing. And in homes, when they didn't have a Christmas tree, they would often decorate the home with greenery, which they would tuck in behind every picture on the wall and lay it on tables and things like that. But eventually the Christmas tree took over as the prime decoration in the house, and people stopped bringing in the holly and the ivy and stuff like that.
Okay, David, I'm getting hungry. Let's talk about what Christmas dinner would have been like in St. John. Were we goose people? Were we turkey people? Were we duck? I don't think we're doing swans like Queen Victoria.
No, as far as eating, the city market was the place to get your produce at that time, to get your Christmas meal. They had the turkeys, and they had the roast beef, and they had the hams, and they had the vegetables. All the things you needed for Christmas were in the city market and right in the center of town. Plus, there were a lot of independent grocers who had Christmas stock, some that were famous for instance, if you wanted to get your plum pudding and your fruit cake, there would be a store set aside for that. And others specialized in candy. The Corona Candy Company and Frank White's Candy Company would specialize in Christmas candies. You would go right to the place where it was produced and buy it there. Frank White Candy Store, or what Corona became Ganong's eventually. So as far as meals went, probably the best place to get a meal in those days would be the Royal Hotel. And they would advertise that they would have Christmas meals available. And their menu was, we couldn't sit down today and eat through their menu. It was that lavish. And one of the things about the Royal Hotel that was really unique is that one day before Christmas, they would give their meal free, but they wouldn't tell you which day it was going to be. So people flocked, hoping that this would be the day you would get your Christmas dinner free. But they would also have, on Christmas Day, besides the hotel, all the restaurants in town would have Christmas dinner, which is the same Victorian type dinner, came right from England, with the Yorkshire pudding and the plum pudding and the sauces and the turkey and the trimmings that you would expect. And that was just a copy of what came right of Victorian England. So
you're making me so hungry, David. We got to go out after the podcast. But okay, question for you, David. I have to ask you this. Have you ever played Snapdragon?
I have not played Snapdragon. Snapdragon was so popular. It maybe the listeners wouldn't know this, but they filled a basin with liquor, and they dropped raisins in the bottom of the basin in the liquid, and then they lit the liquid on fire, and the object was to reach through the flames and snap a raisin. Snapdragon. So it's a very dangerous game. And of course, the other thing that was enjoyed, barley toys were the other thing that were really, because they could make their own barley toys in home. So there were molds for them. They could buy molds and make barley toys. That was the other popular candy treat, besides chocolates. Chocolates were, of course, the ultimate treat.
Getting back to Santa Claus, you said that Santa didn't appear in stores until the 1880s, but what were people talking about him, like telling tales to children? It's hard. I know it's hard to research some of this stuff, but were kids talking about Santa Claus like in the 1860s or 1850s?
Early on, from 1821, when The Night Before Christmas was written, Santa Claus was always part of the season, and he would be the deliverer of the gifts, but no child would see Santa Claus. And it was 1887 before the first image of Santa Claus appears in a New Brunswick newspaper in the Fredericton capital. So children had a mental image of Santa Claus, and the artists were working on developing a pictorial image all through this era. So in the 1890s, you get hundreds of different versions of Santa Claus. But the stores would advertise all through St. John. They would advertise, this is where Santa has his gifts. Come and see Santa. Come and see Santa's gifts. But Santa never appeared. They just said he would. Sometimes they would have cardboard images or something that, their impression. It wasn't until 1887, Manchester's had Santa Claus come on the Saturday night before Christmas, appeared in the window. The store was closed. He just appeared in the window, big picture window, and came out of a fireplace, if I remember correctly, and appeared, and 4,000 people showed up.
Wow.
And they would not disperse. Santa Claus was only supposed to be there for a few minutes. They wouldn't leave. The cops had to be called to disperse the
Another
crowd.
St. John riot.
So a couple more on Santa, because it seems that as the time goes on, Christmas becomes much more about kids and, families. But were kids encouraged to write lists for Santa? Was it the naughty and nice thing like we grew up with, or is that something newer?
No, the children wrote letters to Santa. Many people have told me that they would take their letters and they would burn them up, so the smoke went up to the North Pole, and Santa would get the message. Now, the other mention we made was a Santa catching on fire at a church.
Yes.
And Santa would appear in the 1880s and 1890s at Sunday school parties, and the children were always told Santa's identity. They were not led to believe it was the real North Pole Santa. They were always told who was playing the role. But in one instance, a man portraying Santa, they would hang the gifts on the trees, and Santa had to reach through the candle flames to get the gifts. And in one time at the Fairville Methodist Church, Santa caught fire, and they had to take him outside and roll him in the snow to get the fire out. And then he came back in. The children had to know Santa was not dead.
What a horrific Christmas. Yeah, no, exactly. But it does illustrate the dangers of the Victorian Christmas. We talked about Snapdragon. They liked fire, didn't they, David? They just liked lighting things on fire, such as bowls of brandy or candles on a Christmas tree.
Well, candles on the trees, you see, it's not till, I think, 1882 before the first electric lights, and they don't become popular until long after the Victorian age. But candle-lit trees, the older people have told me that they would light the candles, but they would have somebody standing there with a bucket of sand and a bucket of water because there was such a danger of that tree catching fire.
Greg was saying that you would never see an insurance adjuster around because they wouldn't give you insurance for Christmas tree fires. So that's one person who's not there, the guy with the bucket, but not the insurance adjuster. Okay, moving on to some of the other stuff. I heard, or I actually read, I think it was in your article, if people got very merry at Christmas and may have hit the hard spirits, and that there might have been a little bit of rowdy drunkenness in the streets of St. John. Can you talk to us about the filling up of the drunk tank on Christmas Eve, the St. John Christmas tradition?
Well, that actually happened. And the good thing about that story is this, that the judges often would let those that were incarcerated free to go back with their families. They would often, on Christmas night before Christmas, would free those people to go back. So, although liquor was a big, big part of Christmas, there's no question about it, a sad part in many homes. But the judges were good about it. They let the guys go if they could, and the girls too.
Okay, so not just one gender.
Yeah.
Okay, and there's always been an element of Christmas about giving to the poor. We had the Feast of St. Stephen, which of course predates the Victorian Christmas, but Dickens, the Christmas Carol, really reintroduced the concept of this is the time of year to give to the poor. Do you know anything about how charities worked in St. John in the Victorian era, or how the poor would have celebrated Christmas?
Well, the poor were looked after by the churches. Primarily, the churches took collections on Christmas Day at their services to aid the poor. And beyond that, there wasn't much help for the poor. They probably didn't have much of a Christmas. They probably didn't expect much of a Christmas. They would go to the Sunday schools for Sunday school parties and maybe get a little treat there. Wouldn't matter if they were a member of the congregation or the assembly or what. They would be welcome to come. That would be some Christmas dinners provided socially to the people that were in hospitals or long care homes and things like that.
Orphans, Dave.
Orphanages,
yeah.
Things like that. They were pretty. Seamen's Mission would look after the sailors. And so the poor really didn't have much of a Christmas. It's not till you get to the middle class that they would have some better Christmas, some more normal, what we would consider a good celebration. And then you get to the upper class and they would have an opportunity to have balls and carnivals and shopping. They would have a shop. They would probably some have servants and they would send them to do the shopping, send them to get the Christmas tree in King Square and put the Christmas tree up, send them to decorate, send them the cooks to cook the meals and things like that. So there was quite probably a separation between the three classes that we would think of.
And Dave, do we know that, did most people go to church, do you think, on Christmas Day?
I think the churches did it way better than they do now.
Yeah.
But it's wrong for us to think that everybody went to church. They didn't. But the churches were certainly did special carol services. They did special plays. So I would say spiritually, everybody wasn't involved, but they went. Yeah.
So the church was a big part of Christmas, kind of like it is now with the people who go to church on 2 days out of the year, Easter and Christmas. So it's just a thing to do, whether you are of the faith or not of the faith, that this is the time to go to church. So that's interesting. So the final question, David, would you call a Victorian Christmas in St. John a magical time in St. John history?
I think people enjoyed Christmas probably a little more than we do now, because we have so many opportunities to have celebrations in life today. This was one of the highlights of the Victorian times. Christmas was a real highlight, and it was compressed a little more than it is today. Yes, the merchants began advertising in the middle of November, but most people didn't get into the mood until a few days before Christmas. There was a real concentration for 4 or 5 days. We're going to live life differently. We're going to be a little kinder to one another. We're going to be a little more loving. We're going to be, going to eat a little more food. We're going to drink a little. Anyway, I think it was more concentrated, but I think the people really loved it. They got out to skate on Lily Lake. They would take sleigh rides. There would be special things that happened only at Christmas. And I think they really got into it. I think that's why it's endured and still with us today. Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned kindness, David. I hope we can take that away from the Victorian Christmas ideals, because we know this. Christmas 2024 will be the most wonderful Christmas for someone out there. For some child, it will be that Christmas they'll always think back on with warmth and love. But then Christmas 2024 is going to be a very hard Christmas for many who might be going through tough times. Maybe someone very close to them is no longer there. Christmas is this big celebration that reminds you of everything you had and maybe things you no longer have in your life. And that is why we need to show kindness and understanding to others. And the final kindness is one we often overlook. Be kind to yourself this Christmas. You may be going through hardships or stressing over trying to provide that perfect Christmas for others. Go to the ideals of what Christmas is about, rather than the nostalgic belief in what the perfect Christmas has to be. Show yourself compassion and know for those who love you, all they want and all they need is you. And that is the podcast, Greg and David, and proof, once again, St. John, nothing happened here. Merry Christmas and season's greetings to you, Greg.
And same to you, Mark.
And a Merry Christmas and season's greetings to all our listeners. Without you, we wouldn't have a podcast. We appreciate all the 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, liking and sharing our post, and spreading the word of our show to friends and family. We now have listeners in 19 countries and on every continent, with the exception of Antarctica. That's a hard one to break into. But thank you for helping us share our history with the world. Now, Greg, you had some specific thank yous?
That's right, Mark. We'd like to thank Mark Brewer, host of the podcast MB Traveler, for promoting our show. We'd like to thank Troy Middleton and our four-legged friend Blue, who has promoted our show. Bob Burgess and John Lawrence have provided the music for our show, which is the fiddle tune Cold Frosty Morning. Cassandra Goudreau has provided the intro and outro to each episode. We'd like to thank authors Heather McBrady and David Goss for being interviewed for episodes. Also, David Goss for his years of supporting local history and heritage as an author, provider of walks and talks, and general support of local history. Harold Wright for supporting us behind the scenes with some research tips. I'd also like to thank the University of New Brunswick and CBC New Brunswick for promoting our show when we first launched.
And I'd like to thank my high school teacher from back in the day, Barry Ogden, who has been a big supporter of our show. And thank you to all our friends and family. And thank you, St. John, past, present, and future. We love our city. We hope you have enjoyed our podcast so far. We are wrapping up our first calendar year, but we'll be back in 2025 with all new episodes every 2 weeks on Tuesdays.
Thank you for listening to St. John, Nothing Happened Here. To learn more, join us at www.nothinghappenedhere.ca or connect with us on Facebook. Other means of communication include, but are not limited to, telegrams, smoke signals, and carrier pigeons. However you want to reach us, we want to hear from you.